So the Gemara tells us in the end of Tainus, the Talmud says in the end of Tainus like this: Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Berei de Rabbi Shmuel bar Shilat. Rabbi Yehuda, who's the son of Rabbi Shmuel bar Shilat, said, the name of Rav, one of the last sages of the Tanoim, first of that kishem kishenichnas b'simcha, just like when the month of Av enters, we decrease in the idea of joy, which is also applicable in Jewish law and halacha, of the way we eat less meat and other things that we do when the month of Av enters. Kach, the similarly, kishenichnas Adar marb b'simcha, when the month of Adar enters, we increase in joy. So there is a decrease in joy during the month of Av, which the month of Av is the month of the destruction of both Beis HaMikdash, of both temples in Jerusalem and Yerushalayim. And just like there's a decrease in that one, there's an increase during the month of Adar, which, like Rashi writes, that it's the days of Purim that leads up to the days of Pesach. That this one, so the idea of the redemption from the story of Purim story leading up to the story of the Passover and the Pesach story. The question is really, what is the juxtaposition here? What does it mean? Just like when Av enters, that we decrease in joy, similarly when Adar enters, we increase in joy. Now, obviously, it's trying to say that one is a decrease in joy, and one is an increase in joy. But what is the decrease in joy of Av, and how is it related to the increase of joy, which we're supposed to be increasing every single day during this month of Adar? There has to be some type of correlation between these two ideas, that the decrease in one and the increase in the other are related to each other. The other interesting thing is to take note is who is the author of this statement. Now, the author is Rav, but it's said over, Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shmuel bar Shilat. Now, who is Rabbi Shmuel bar Shilat? So the Gemara, the Talmud, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Sadik Vav tells us, 96 tells us, that with regards to Haman, which is Amalek, the Bnei Banav Shal Haman, from the great-grandchildren of Haman, Lamdu Torah b'Bnei Brak, learned Torah in Bnei Brak. And that means that there were sages of the Gemara, of the Talmud, that arose from the grandchildren, the descendants of Haman, which is the protagonist of the story, one of the protagonists of the story of Purim. That Haman, who is from Agag, from Amalek, which is a nation that has to be eradicated completely and obliterated, there's a descendant of Haman who actually learned Torah in Bnei Brak. And in the version of the Ein Yaakov, it actually says, and who was that person? Who was the Bnei Banav Shel Haman? That was Shmuel bar Shilat. That Shmuel bar Shilat was actually that grandchild. Yehuda, the son of Shmuel bar Shilat, is the great grandson. So these are descendants of Haman. So there's something very profound being said here, that somehow there is a Torah, there's a teaching, there's a spiritual wisdom that arises from the place of Haman, or some type of tikkun, some type of rectification, what Haman represents, which is the idea of Amalek, and the idea of happenstance, of nikra, shakar chavadar, some type of idea of happenstance, related to the idea of Shmuel bar Shilat, which is connected to the word Shilat, is related to the word Shivisi, or is an acronym for the word Shivisi Hashem Leneg L'Sami, which is I place Hashem in front of me at all times, and Shivisi comes from the word Shava, which is equanimity. So let's understand this a little further. Also, what is the wording of the sages that say Mishenichnas Av, when Av enters, and Mishenichnas Adar? Now, entering, now you can say that time comes, Shabbos, it's a time as a coming. Entering sounds like it's a spatial thing. So there's the world of time and the world of space. When we say we enter into of or we enter into other, it seemed to suggest that even though it's related to something, to a flow of time, the month of Av, which is the decrease in joy, or the month of Adar, which we increase in joy, but there's some type of spatial relationship as well. There's a nichnas, there's an entering into. So when we think about the month of Av, and then we'll contrast that to the month of Adar. So Av generally is Megalgmus Chusleim Chayev, which means Av generally is a month that's connected to our collective destruction, and particularly the destruction of our bias, of the Beis Hamikdash, of the house, the Holy Temple. Now, the temple in Hebrew is called not a temple, but it's actually called a bias. It's called a home, our essential home, our essential place. And in fact, the Beis Hamikdash, which is the essential home, the home of Klal Yisrael, of the people of Israel, in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, that place where the Beis Hamikdash, where the bias, where the home is in the place of the Hamakom, of the place. It's the place Menu Hushas Kol Olam Kulei, where all space, like the Talmud Gemara says in Yuma, all space flows from that particular place. So when Yaakov, for example, in the dream of the angels ascending and descending, Vayifka, the verse says, Vayifka Bamakim, he encountered the space. What is that space? That's the Makan HaMikdash. That's the place of the Beis HaMikdash. In the language of the Rambam, Maimonides, in Hilchos Beis HaBchir, when the Rambam talks about, for example, the Mizbeach, so in Hilchos Beis HaBchir, Perek Beis, the Rambam says, HaMizbeach v'koimoi mechuvam b'yoseh, the place of the Mizbeach, which is, according to the Rambam, the most essential vessel of the Beis HaMikdash, the altar, is mekoimoi, its space is very intentional. It's the space that Adam Rishon, that man, the original man, brought an offering. It's the place where where mankind was created. Misham Nivra, the Rama writes. That's the place he was created. And like the Chazal tell us, the sages tell us, Adam and Makom Kaparasa Nivra, that a person was created from a place of his atonement. So it's specifically connected to the space, the space, the makom, and the bias is in that space. The home of the Beis Hamikdash was in that space. That is that's Misham Nivra, that's the place we were created, and that's the place of our atonement. So the Beis Hamikdash represents the temple. The Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim represents our essential space, our makom. It's the makom, it's the place, Shemena Hushtas is the place where all space arises from. It's the nekuda of all space. It's the point of all space. And it's the place that we belong. It's our space. And it's the place of our birth. And because it's the place of our birth and it's our essential space, it's actually the place of our joy. Because joy, simcha, joy is expressed in its space, which means when you're in your space, when you're in your home, when you're in the place where you belong, in your place, in your makom, that's the place where joy sprouts. That's the place where a person feels most expressive and most alive, when a person is connected deeply into that place. So Eretz Yisrael, in general, the land of Israel, is our makom. And within Eretz Yisrael itself, within the land of Israel itself, the Beis Hamikdash, the holy home, is the space, is the space where is the essential space is expressed, and that's therefore the Beis Hamikdash is actually the place where all joy emanates. And it was actually, for example, Simchas Beis HaShe'eva, the Simcha, the joy of the Beis HaShe'eva, the place where it was the house that was drawn. That's the place that comes joy. Now, the bias, this Beis Hamikdash, and particularly the first Beis Hamikdash, then there was the Churban Beis Hamikdash. Then there was the destruction of the temple, destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. And at the time when there was the Galus, when there was the exile from Eretz Yisrael, from the land of Israel, and the base Hamikdash was destroyed, we lost our makom, we lost our space, and we lost our essential ground of being. We lost where we belonged in our space. And when we lost our space, we automatically lost our joy. And because the joy arises from a person being in their home, in their space, and when we lost that space, we lost our joy. That's why when a person, for example, is a mourning, God forbid, when a person loses a parent, the name of Hashem, that hamakam yanachem eschem, that the makam should bring your comfort. We use specifically that name of Hashem. Why do we use the specifically? Why don't we say Hashem yanachem eschem? Hashem should bring you comfort. We say hamakam yanachem eschem, because when a person loses, God forbid, a parent, for example, they lose their space, their ground of being, their place where they know to be their home, where they came from, their roots. And God forbid, a person loses a parent, certainly when a person at a young age, they lose their footing, they lose their space, they don't know where to find themselves, they don't know where their root is. And because of that, they're in mourning, and there's an absence of joy. And when a person comes to bring comfort to someone that lost someone, we say that Hamakom, the source of all space, the root of all space, the Mekayim Shel Olam, the space that gives all space its possible existence, should bring you comfort and bring you a new space, allow you to find your footing again, allow you to find your space, allow you to find a home for yourself, maybe a new home or your own home, no longer in your parents' home, that will allow you to bring you into a place of joy and comfort. That's why it's specifically Hamakam Yanachem Eschem, that space, the ultimate space, should give you that space in this world, to share that space. And therefore, collectively, when our home was destroyed, in the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and we went into exile, we lost our joy. And this is what the sages say. Kishem, just like in Av, we lost our space, and because we lost our space, we lost our joy. Therefore, we decrease in joy. Kach mishenichos Av. The same Adar, just like the same, similarly when the Adar enters, the month of Adar, we have to increase in joy, because what is the miracle? What does the events of Purim represent? Purim, the story of Purim occurs after the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, after the destruction of our space. We were no longer at home, no longer in our home and in our homeland, and we're now in a place of exile. And it's a nes shebachutz la'aretz, it's a miracle that occurred outside of Eretz Yisrael. This is the first time that Klal Yisrael collectively is predominantly living outside of the land of Israel, the Persian and the Babylonian lands. And we don't have a Beis Hamikdash. We don't have a home, an essential home that brings us this joy. And the story of Purim showed us that even in the place where we are in exile, we were no longer physically connected to our space, to our essential space, Makom Shenivra, the place that we were born into, created from, the place of the Beis Hamikdash. Even in the place where we are no longer there, in any space that we are, every place that we go, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is always resting with us. And that's in fact the Gemara, that the teaching of our sages would say, Kol makom shegala Shekhinah imam, any place that we exiled, the Shekhinah was present with us, is actually recorded in the Gemara Megillah, in the tractate that talks about the Purim story, because that's the Purim story. The Purim story revealed to us that even in exile, Hashem is present with us. Even in the place of Anochi Aster, even in a place of complete concealment, which is the idea of Esther, even the idea of a place of concealment, even there, Hashem is present. And that's what actually the name Adar, the month, and the name of the month Adar actually means, like the Chassidic master says, Adar means the Aleph, the Alufa Shaloilam, the presence of the Creator that is Dar, that rests, even in the place that appears to be in a place of exile and of separation, where we don't have our makom. And even in a place that we don't find our space, even in that space, the Aleph rests there and gives us space to exist. And this is present in every single space that we're at. and most prominently in the space that we call a Beis HaKnesses or Beis HaMedrash, which is also recorded. The Gemara talks about this in the end of Megillah, end of that tractate, and Chazal say, the sage tell us, that Asida Batik and the sea is Batik Bavel, that eventually the Batik Midrashis of Batik and the sea is the shuls and the houses of study that exist within Babylon, because that's the time, in that period of exile, the Jews predominantly lived in Babylon, will eventually, Sheikhu Eretz Yisrael will eventually return back and become part of Eretz Yisrael. They'll return back into Eretz Yisrael, return back into the land. So even in the place of exile, the shul, the sanctuary, the space that we carve out for ourselves to connect to Hashem, in our exile, that is a part that will eventually return back into our bias, into our space, into our makom. The Maharsha, one of the great commentaries on this Gemara, says that the future Beis HaMikdash, the future temple, the future Beis HaMikdash, the home, the sacred home, our collective sacred home, in the Bayis HaShlishi, in the third Beis HaMikdash, which should be rebuilt in Meher V'Yameinu, that Beis HaMikdash will actually include all the shuls and all the yeshivas and all the Bat Midrashis from exile throughout time. In other words, that the Beis HaMikdash of l'Asilave, the Beis HaMikdash of the future, will be a combination of all the spaces that we created in exile that became sacred space, that became our place, that became our makom. Kaveyo makom l'tfilase. Someone like that we are makom kavua, the place that we daven particularly, or we learn particularly, that space will become, all those sacred spaces will become part of the Beis HaMikdash, part of the future Beis HaMikdash. And that's why the Mashal writes that even in exile, where we're no longer in the Eretz Yisrael, we're no longer in the Beis HaMikdash, so we're no longer in the Beis HaMikdash, no longer in the temple, that even in exile, when a person stands, wherever they are in the world, if they stand in a Beis HaKnesses, they stand in a shul, in a synagogue, and they stand there and they pray, and that place is a makom, that place is a sacred space, they're actually standing in the Beis HaMikdash l'Asilave. They're actually standing in part of the Beis HaMikdash that exists, that will exist in the future time. That's because that's a small part of the collective great Beis HaMikdash of the future. And even on a deeper level, this even includes our home and every space that we are. There's some Sofer that writes in the drashas. Some Sofer says that in the Seder night, when a person celebrates Pesach and celebrates the sacred avodah, spiritual work that's done on the Seder night in their own home, that place itself was also part of the Beis HaMikdash l'Asilave. Also becomes part of the temple of the future, which means that's also part of our makom, our essential space, which very deeply means that every makom, every space that we live deeply in that space, wherever we are in this world, in any place in exile, wherever we are in this world, any space that we live deeply in that space, and we connect to Hashem, and we connect to the source of all space, and we connect deeply to the Creator in that place, that becomes part of our space, and therefore that's a place that brings us joy. And that was revealed in Purim, that even in the place of exile, even in the place where things seem to be post-destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, and collectively this was the first time that we exist in exile, even there, Aleph Dar, that Hashem's presence was there, and we were able to celebrate and to recognize the hand of Hashem in the story, in a very uneventful, unmiraculous story of Purim in one way, in a very natural story where Hashem's name is not present, to recognize that even there is the Aleph Dar. And that's what the teaching is saying. Kishem, just like Kach, the same way when we lost our geographical Beis HaMikdash, or our geographical makom, our particular geographical space, and because of that, because we lost our space, we were in a deep state of mourning and Avelis, and this is what we actually experience with the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. We experience Avelis, and all the laws of Avelis, all the laws of mourning are applicable, just like, God forbid, a person loses a parent. We're saying that Kishem, just like then, in the month of which we commemorate the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, and because of that, destruction of our bias, destruction of our makom. Similarly, Kach, we have to understand that when other comes, which is the final, the Sof Kol, is the end of all miracles, and the miracle of the beginning of the miracles of the future, which reveals to us that even though we don't have a makom, we're still in the place that we are. We can create that makom and that space wherever we are to reveal the Eretz Yisrael, the quality of the Nakud of Eretz Yisrael, of the land of Israel, and not only the land of Israel, the Beis Hamikdash within that space. And that's the wonderful thing, is that's the kishem. That's why kishenichnas, there's a spatial dimension. When you enter into other, it's not only a time idea, but also when you enter into this space. So in contrary to Haman, who says that Klal Yisrael is mefuzar u'mefoyer ben ha'amim, that Klal Yisrael has no longer any space. They're dispersed throughout all the nations, and they don't have a space, and therefore they're vulnerable, and therefore they're depressed spiritually. And that's what that Yashon, Yeshna Am Echad, that there is a nation, but Yashon also means Yashon, that they're asleep. They're asleep. They're no longer in their awakened state of their awareness of their space, and therefore they're spiritually depressed, and therefore they can be crushed. The tikkun for that, the ultimate transformation of that, is that Shmuel Bar Shilat, the name of Shmuel Bar Shilat, which is descendants of Haman, come along to reveal that the opposite is true. That kishem kishenichnas of, just like when of enters, we have to decrease in joy. The descendants of Haman come along and say that the tikkun, the Torah that's revealed in Gullus and exile, is a transformation of that idea that even in exile is Adar Amorim Hashem, that we can sense the greatness of Hashem's presence in Adar, and that's why we have to be joyful. The joy arises from Oiz V'Ched V'Mkayim. The joy arises when we're home, when we're present, when we're anchored, when we know who we are and what we're doing in this world, what our purpose in this world is, and we're connected to that. We're connected to our purpose and to our reason of being, and we recognize that there's an intentionality for being in this exile, to reveal the Mekayim Shalom, the presence of Hashem in every single space, at every single corner of the universe. So wherever we are, we can be connected. That brings us joy and true happiness, knowing who we are and knowing how to express that sense of self. And this is what the teaching is. Kishem, just like in destruction, brings a decrease in joy because we lost our space. The higher revealing of other reveals kach, that even in any space that we are in this world, and certainly in any time you're on this world, we can connect, we can be connected, and therefore we can experience true joy.